All right, welcome to GSC session number 3. This is being recorded in post, but we are doing a session today on finding your genre because every game requires something a bit unique. All right, so to begin with, you should have an idea of what the game is. You should know all the important stuff about the game by the time that you start thinking about the soundscape. So, like what genre it is, what kind of speed the gameplay is at, what the setting is, or what the settings are if there's more than one, as well as the mood and the tone. You should also be thinking about the story. Basically, just every aspect of the game design should be coming together in your mind to form some sort of basis for what the soundscape will be. And from there, once you build off the basic ideas, you can figure out what genre of music it'll be. All right, so starting out broad with the answers here, you're going to want to make sweeping statements that could be applied to the game generally, and have a couple word answers to the individual questions I outlined in the last slide. So, for example, an FPS that evokes a sense of exploration in a grand and mysterious place can lead to ancient, mysterious, and epic, being words that you would use to describe that. And I'm definitely not referring to Halo when I say that. As for another example, Demons, Mars, Shotgun, and Hell pretty easily sums up Doom. So, getting those answers, if you combine them all, you can start to develop a clearer picture of what the soundscape will sound like. And yeah, drawing connections between the music you've heard and these words will help sort of find a way to make the genre work better with what you're working with. And to wrap up this slide, you should keep iterating, always iterate on what you have. Iteration is key to making sure that whatever you have is the best you have. That makes no sense. Some genres to get you thinking. Start off with chiptune, which back in the day, there was very limited memory, as everyone knows. So a lot of the music was synthesized or made up of like 8-bit blips and bloops, which is chiptune. Alright, and then there's gent, which rock and metal go hand in hand with often. They're all often seen together, and they're often used for intense combat or similar actions that require big energy from the player. There's synthwave and electronica, which cover pretty much everything between chillwave and the more vibey ambient stuff and like J-pop or Eurobeat, that kind of thing. So it offers a ton of variation in what you can find there. And then there's orchestral pieces, and a lot of action games use large orchestral pieces to set the feeling of, oh yeah, this is going to be large scale and epic. But they can also be used in a much more intimate and moody way, like a lot of the more depressing songs from Halo and Destiny soundtracks over the years. They use a lot of larger arrangements in their emotional songs. And having a large arrangement with a really grand piece is really great at showing the scale of something, whether it's the scale of like a big battle or an emotional impact on the player. And jazz is becoming a bit more prominent in games as of late, with Persona 5 soundtrack having some jazzy tracks to it, Cuphead's entire score being jazz-based to reflect the 20s aesthetic, and even Jump Up Superstar from Mario Odyssey being pretty jazz-inspired. And last but not least, there is ambient music. So you get your drone metals here, you get your just weird noises for about 30 minutes per song, and that can really help set the tone of the game as well. Alright, instrumentation and its connection to genre. So strings work with pretty much everything, and by everything I mean like every genre. You just have to use them right, because strings are pretty universal in that they could be used in a ton of different scenarios because there's so many different stringed instruments. Like it covers everything from pianos to acoustic guitars to electric guitars, and then there's all the big band and ensemble stuff like violas, violins, cellos, contrabasses, that kind of thing. And each of these has its uses, but the versatility of strings is something to remember because there's almost always a place for it in the music, regardless of the genre. And the same thing applies to percussion, because it's not just the drum kit or like the big, big war drums. Because there's also stuff like timpanis, but there's also things like glockenspiels and like wood blocks, the xylophone. A lot of different instruments are found in the percussion section. So there's a use for it in every genre and shouldn't be forgotten about because it's really integral to kind of solidifying the feel of the piece. Calm music often has piano and acoustic guitar, irregardless of genre, but particularly piano, since that can carry through nearly any genre. And in contrast to that, bombastic pieces often have a lot of brass, and when the brass is there, it often does like a big swell or like a lot of staccatos to really emphasize the bombasticness of the piece. All right, and now onto the fun stuff. Applying all of this knowledge to your music. So there's not really a strictly right or wrong way of doing this, as with most sound and music stuff. But here's some tips, anyways, just because it's helpful. So keeping things under hierarchical umbrellas is really helpful. And as Mick Gordon once said in his GDC talk, that I will continue to bring up as long as this club exists, he got the ideas for everything should sound like Doom, and then under there's a few different settings. Like there's the UAC facilities, there's Hell itself, and then there's all the industrial bits, and there's also like all the Argent Denur stuff with the Sentinels. So from there, everything is split into the individual scenarios and encounters associated under this umbrella. And it just kind of helps to tie things together more cohesively. Blending genres is really helpful as well. And for this example, I'm going to use Primordial, the game we worked on last year. So the gameplay was very classic FPS inspired. So we took some cues from Doom, as we did with most of the game's design, and went with a lot of hard rock stuff. But it had a very sci-fi focus to it. Like it took place in space on a big ship. Some of the enemies were aliens, that kind of thing. So I decided to throw in a bunch of synths in there because that's, pretty emblematic of the sci-fi setting. So it ended up having a very like heavy rock sound with a bit of electronica in there just to mix it up a bit. Using themes and tone to help define the mood. So if the game is really dark, using a lot of minor chords and low bass notes usually come with that. So from there you could go, okay, we could do a big brass section in a big orchestral piece. And while the brass is going like really low with all the bassy tones, you can have the strings doing some sort of trills or staccatos to really unnerve the player. Or if the game's like a bullet hell or something, those games are usually fast paced and pretty frantic with really, they're fast. So having music with a really fast tempo would suit that fairly well. So something like Eurobeat would go along with it really well as some of the more aggressive forms of pop. And develop the music as time progresses. So don't just repeat the same instrumentation throughout the whole game. Try to build off of it and expand on the ideas. So think of it like the game's core musical ideas are like a tree, and it has all the various branches. It's kind of like the umbrella one. So they all come from the greater vibes encompassing the whole game, but they can be their own thing. Even if it's as simple as something just starting with an orchestral piece and then having a rock version for a more intense bit of gameplay with combat or something. And then for an emotional hit, you go to a more ambient, mellow version of the piece that has a bit more like chill wave to it. And then maybe like a fast-paced Eurobeat or J-pop style uh, tune or variation of the piece for a bullet hell section where you got to go really fast. So, point is mixing it up while you're keeping it in the same sort of vibe and under the same umbrella makes it a pretty good bit of variation to have. And now, time for a few examples. And starting it off, we're going to be doing Doom. It's a genre defining game. It basically birthed the FPS as a genre, starting out with Doom clones before it actually was named the FPS genre. So naturally, Doom using metal and some electronic metal in tandem with its violence carried on throughout the years in the legacy of the FPS, with Quake following, and a lot of classic games like Blood doing that, and Heretic did that as well. Um, and but as the years went on, and the genre became a bit more focused on tactically based games like Call of Duty and other similar games that wanted to be grounded or a bit more grounded than a dude running at Mach 3 with 20 guns. Doom 2016 was a great return to form, with Mick Gordon's soundtrack kind of bringing back that edginess from the 90s metal, and kind of bringing back that edginess from the 90s FPS games with the metal he made. So he brought it back in a really genty way, again with a lot of synth work and electronic beats, and it made everything new while still feeling like Doom. And talking about that umbrella thing earlier that I basically, well, he came up with, or at least he said, the UAC and Mars levels, they have a very industrial metal and power metal feel to it. It also has a lot of kind of empty and desolate sounds to it, with a lot of atmosphere built into it. And then when the demons come in, that's when the guitars and the heaviness and the metal begins. So under all that, there's still the synths that are, like I said earlier, in regards to Primordial, they're pretty linked with science fiction. So there's that, which is UAC and Mars and all that. But then there's also Argent Nur and the Sentinels, which kind of have a very medieval esque sound to it. They have a lot of big choirs, with a bit of demonic infestation or like corruption even, where like the big choirs voices will eventually turn into screams, and then electronics and guitars. Kind of jumping off of that, Hell itself, it's filled with a lot of screaming in the music. There's a lot of dark and evil synths kind of lurking under all the melodies, and there's a lot of corrupted and really distorted sine waves which kind of flare out, and it feels violent to listen to, if that makes sense. So it suits Doom perfectly. And moving on to another game that we'd never talk about here, Halo Combat Evolved. So the first Halo game is very focused on player exploration and a sense of wonder and mystery, because this is the first game, obviously, so you don't know, okay, why is there a giant floating artificial ring here? What does it do? Who's the Covenant? Why are they chasing after us? Why are they trying to kill us? Why are we in a war? And why do they really want to keep Halo safe? So all this mystery and all these questions are kind of transferred into the soundtrack. So humanity has very heroic kind of wartime reminiscent music with a lot of horns and drums, which are really prominent in the level Halo, the second level of the game, when you're like rallying troops again after escaping from the ship as it's crashing. So kind of conflicting against that, there's the Covenant's music, which is very strange. It's got a lot of electronic sounds in it. It's got a few bleeps and bloops. But overall, it's very incredibly distinct from all the humanity and UNSC focused music. And it feels distinctly alien. And speaking of distinctly alien, there's the Forerunners, which they're ancient, obviously, because they're the ones who built the rings hundreds and hundreds of thousands of years before the game takes place. And that's reflected in the visuals, but it's also reflected in the music with the Gregorian chants. Um, so that chant, it kind of evokes that sense of ancientness and wonder from the player. And a similarly ancient thing, the Flood, their music fits perfectly with the kind of horror, like the body horror that it brings out. It's really uncomfortable to listen to with the staccatos, and it's generally unnerving, fitting it perfectly. And here's Anthony taking it away with Stardew Valley.
Surprise, surprise. Oh my God. So Stardew Valley is an excellent choice for this because uh, it has several different layers. And I'm just gonna assume that you guys know what Stardew Valley is. I wrote, in truth, a bunch of things explaining how Stardew Valley works, but I'm assuming you guys know what it is. So basically, uh, the reason why this is an example here is because there are so many different tracks that give different vibes. Uh, the most prominent of that is the seasons. So for music specifically, uh, the different seasons have different tracks that convey different messages. So spring is more of like upbeat and like explorative or explorative sort of sounding tracks, whereas winter is very like slow um, and beautiful, and it typically has like those kind of bell sounds that you kind of associate with like ice and cold, and snow. And it has like a couple of different tracks. I think it's three different tracks for every season. And then as well for the mines part of the game, it has a different set of tracks for how low in the mines you go. And basically, the reason why this is a great example is because even though Stardew Valley is like Animal Crossing-esque uh, kind of game, uh, and it's like a pixel art game, and you would think like, oh, it's just like kind of this like synthesized stuff. It's whatever. It has all these different vibes to it um, that you can pick up just from like listening to the music, and it pairs perfectly with the visuals, especially with the seasons. So even though this game may not be like a sad game or may not be like a super like action-packed game, there's still like obviously different tracks that convey these emotions by taking the genre in that direction. So yeah.
Yeah. All right. And that concludes it. Like I said, not a very long session. It's around 22 minutes at the moment, so wow. But really important thing, next week's session for all two of you is good god.
Yikes.
Yeah. But yeah, next week's session is gonna be huge. Um, so just a little tease for it. We'll be doing a deep dive into linear and adaptive music, and by deep dive, I'm talking it's probably gonna be like maybe over an hour. I'm gonna be working on cutting it down. Um, and it's gonna be packed with detail the whole way through. Been working on it for a ton, or for a while. A ton of time and effort has gone into making it the best one yet. So make sure you're there if you're interested. And thanks for coming out tonight. Really appreciate that.
Tell your friends.
Yes, tell your friends and everyone else. Please.